In this discussion, I'm going to talk about what I call the destabilizing and the restabilizing of gender in Dracula. And essentially what I want to argue is that this text is a dream fantasy about gender queerness that is explored, fantasized about, and it turns into a nightmare and has to be turned back into a dreamlike memory or normal. So the gist of the argument is that this whole novel explores, fantasizes about what happens when gender queerness is expressed in men and in women, and how that eventually becomes a wish fulfillment that is dangerous and needs to be restabilized. Put another way, I want to say that this is a fantasy of the id, seeking its pleasure principle in terms of gender queerness, but the superego has to vigorously assert control over this gender destabilizing and set it right. It's very much like releasing social tension in a festival and then punishing the people who participated in the party because they got out of control. So we'll take a look at how this plays out. In particular, we're only looking at 2 chapters in this talk, chapter 16, where Lucy gets staked in her coffin. And I want to make an argument about that scene, that this is really a sublimated, inhibited aim expression of a gangbang, and that rape of Lucy becomes a way of feminizing her again by basically screwing her, and that penetration of her body is an expression of male domination that restores her to her normal feminine self. Because of course, once she has become a vampire, she becomes the bloofer lady and preys on children, which speaks to a loss of her femininity, the loss of the maternal instinct. It certainly would have been understood that way to the Victorian mind, and she needs to be refeminized and then dispensed with. The other chapter we're going to look at, chapter 21, is where Dracula encounters Mina in the bedroom and forces her to his breast. It's a very gender ambiguous gesture, as I'll show you, because it is forceful and masculine, and at the same time, when he cuts his chest open and forces her to suck the blood out of his chest, it's almost like a breastfeeding process, and mind-boggling in terms of which gender he's supposed to be there. So let me unpack this for you and talk a little bit about how gender is explored among the male characters and the female characters in this text. We start with Jonathan Harker, and I've already spoken a little bit about this in lecture, but this is chapter 3, May 15th. As Harker wanders through the castle, he ends up being a guest and sleeping in a room that had been occupied by ladies in bygone days. And so the more time he spends in Dracula's presence, the more he begins to resemble the feminine. He occupies the space of femininity. He becomes more passive. He becomes stereotypically feminine in the sense of vulnerable and underhanded and manipulated, which we remember when we discussed the Malleus. A lot of women became that way. Not that they're that way by nature, but when you face tyranny, the only smart thing to do is to outsmart it and to deceive it. And so that's the sense that I mean that in. Also in chapter 3, Harker says, I determined not to return tonight to the gloom-haunted rooms, but to sleep here, where of old ladies had sat and sung and lived sweet lives, while their gentle breasts were sad for their menfolk away in the midst of remorseless wars. So he moves from sitting in a place that ladies of bygone days used to occupy, to sleeping where they used to sleep. And after he has that heterosexual fantasy with the three vampiresses, you have this moment of recognition here where he looks at the dark-haired one and says, you know, I seem to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear. That aggressive female vampire is a masculinized female, and so she is gender queer in that sense. Remember too that Jung says that the repressed part of the male is the anima, the feminine side, but in really repressed males, the anima takes on a masculine quality. You're so repressed that your feminine side actually looks a bit masculine. And what I want to suggest is that his confrontation with that vampiress is a confrontation with his own repressed femininity. And that's why he recognizes her. She is the aggressor. She is the leader of the group of three. And it really is an encounter with his unconscious mind. The moment he discovers that, he starts to refer to these women as awful women and develops a loathing and hatred for them, as I suggest, because they represent what he has repressed in himself. Arthur is Arthur, good old Arthur, stable, noble, one expression of masculinity, gallant, chivalric. Quincy, the macho expression of masculinity, American, outspoken. This is a great line from Lucy. Mr. Quincy P. Morris found me alone. It seems that a man always does find a girl alone. This sense that his masculinity is kind of predatory and that he discovers her. Of course, he walks around with a great Bowie knife, a large phallic symbol. And that sort of asserts his masculinity. Seward is the psychologist. I'm not going to say too much about him. Van Helsing, clearly masculine, all about control and energy and forcefulness, even though he is mystical and scientific at the same time. Lucy, and by the way, I put Harker in pink up here because I think he is feminized right from the beginning. And I put Lucy in pink because she is feminine, and Mina in blue. We'll come to that. But the point about Lucy is that she is flirtatious. When she's sitting in the cemetery with Captain Swales, the men pay more attention to her than to Mina. Mina doesn't seem to notice it because she's kind of clued out to that. She's all engaged in the argument. But seems like the word bloofer, it's only speculation, but some critics have said it's the way a child with a speech impediment might say the word beautiful, that she's a bloofer lady. And the nature of her predatory vampireness is that she is not strong enough or does not have enough killer instinct, enough masculinity within her to prey upon adults, but she can prey upon children. As I say, for the Victorian mindset, that really masculinizes her, defeminizes her, and makes her, she has destabilized the feminine gender by behaving this way, and she has to be restabilized. This is Mina. I've got her in blue because she is genderqueer. I've already told you that she uses all the latest technologies of phonographs and typewriters to gather information, and that these secretary roles are radical in Stoker's day simply because these were normally men's jobs. This is Van Helsing describing Mina. She has a man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. There's that wonderful scene, you'll have to look for it, but it's after the death of Lucy, Quincy breaks down in tears. And that's a moment of Quincy's feminization. And it's Mina whose maternal instinct comes into play, and she holds him while he cries. that is a very interesting genderqueer moment because Quincy is so masculine becomes feminine, and Mina, who is so masculine in other parts of the story, becomes the nurturing mother or a symbol of the feminine when she holds him as he cries on her lap. Finally, this is Van Helsing talking about Madame Mina. Not a word of her trance. She know it not, and it would overwhelm her and just make her despair. When most we want all her great brain, which is trained like a man's brain. We need access to Mina's brain. But again, the same phrase, a sweet woman, that she has a special power with the Count. Now, don't forget, as they chase the Count back into the Carpathian Mountains, they're relying on Mina's telepathic connection to the Count. And that telepathic connection is a function of her feminine qualities. It's intuition and that kind of connection. Mina is also a very interesting figure because she, is it Mina or Lucy? I have to look. I've forgotten. I think it's Mina. It might be Lucy. All those four men, I think it's Lucy. All those four men participate in blood transfusions into these women once they are attacked by the Count. And so you have, in fact, symbolically the blood of all these men inside a female body. And that, again, is another way of symbolizing genderqueerness. All right, let's turn our attention to chapter 16 and the staking of Lucy. They follow her back to her crypt, and it's empty when they get there, but they're waiting for her to return because they know they have to stake her to death. There's a long spell of silence. The professor says, "Shh." He pointed, and far down the avenue of yews there's a white figure in advance, a dim white figure that held something dark at its breast. That is the maternal pose. The figure stopped, and at that moment a ray of moonlight fell on the masses of driving clouds, showed that the dark-haired woman, dressed in the cerements of the grave, and what has happened to Lucy as she is transformed into this genderqueer monster is that her hair goes from light to dark. If you remember, the Count's hair is also dark, is gray, but his vampiress, the lead vampiress, is dark. We could not see the face. Once again, this notion that she might represent part of the unconscious, perhaps a repressed anima that is masculinized, for it was bent down over what we saw to be a fair-haired child. There was a pause and a sharp little cry, such as a child gives in its sleep or a dog as it lies before the fire and dreams. We were starting forward, but the professor's warning hand, seen by us as he stood behind the yew tree, kept us back. And as the figure comes into focus, it is Lucy Westerna. But how changed? And this is her genderqueer transformation. Take a look at this. The sweetness had turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. So she is both hypersexual, hypersexualized, and masculinized in her abandonment of her feminine qualities. That makes her a monster. That makes her, in the eyes of mainstream culture, a monster that has to be neutralized. Van Helsing stepped out, and obedient to his gesture, we all advanced too. The four of us ranged in a line before the door of the tomb. Van Helsing raised his lantern and drew the slide. By the concentrated light that fell on Lucy's face, we could see the lips were crimson with flesh blood, and that the stream that had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her lawn death robe. So this is a degeneration for Lucy. And you see here this narrative. When Lucy, I called the thing that was before us Lucy because it bore her shape, but it wasn't her. So this is why I call her a monster, or she's objectified. An angry snarl, such as a cat gives when taken unawares. She is causing shudders of horror, and there's cold-bloodedness in her. And her sexual aggressiveness becomes also a gesture of monstrosity. Come to me, Arthur. Leave these others and come to me. My arms are hungry for you. Come and we can rest together. Come, my husband, come. There was something diabolically sweet in her tones. And this phrase here, the tingling of a glass when struck, is exactly the phrase that Harker uses when the three vampiresses hover over him and are about to attack him. So it's the same auditory experience that Arthur experiences with Lucy as Harker experiences with the three vampiresses. She goes to attack them, and of course Van Helsing has to spring in between them and save her. So Arthur's finally realized, how am I supposed to do my work? What am I supposed to do? And so Van Helsing, just a little further down, has to step up to the plate and stake his fiancée. So it's a section, I'm still in the same chapter here. She seemed like a light nightmare of Lucy. Here it is. So look at this. Is this really Lucy's body or only a demon in her shape? Van Helsing. It is her body and yet not. But wait a while and you will all see her as she was and is. She seemed like a nightmare, and that's why I'm calling this whole fantasy a nightmare, because Lucy has been hypersexualized and hypermasculinized. And as she lay there, the pointed teeth, the bloodstained voluptuous mouth, sexual reference obviously and reminiscent of Dracula as well, the whole carnal and unspiritual appearance seemed like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. So the old Lucy is the feminine ideal, passive, inert, sexual, obedient to men, and she has become this sort of aggressive monster. So they're ready to start this ritual, and Van Helsing has to offer an explanation. He says, we have to do this. We have to she's been cursed with immortality. And they will go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind. Two things about this. Number one, it's highly reminiscent of the creature telling Victor Frankenstein that he wants a mate, and Victor Frankenstein imagining the horror of having this creature reproduce a whole other subspecies. It is also highly irresistible to compare this to the COVID-19 virus that is expanding exponentially. And so Van Helsing says, this is the head source of it, and we have to kill it, or she will go and spread it on to others. So Arthur now, it comes to Arthur, and he saw too what we all did, the infinite kindness which suggested that his should be the hand which would restore Lucy to us as holy and not an unholy memory. And so it's his job to restore Lucy's sexual gender queerness back to the passive, inert woman that she is. And it is a rape scene, and I want you to, I'm going to set this up because as I read it through, I'm going to give you the tip-off before I start reading it. So as Arthur begins to drive this stake into Lucy, it mimics a phallic penetration, and the deeper he drives the stake, the more each of them begins to moan and groan, and it looks more and more like a sexual act that ends in orgasm. And that is what Freud calls inhibited aim. That is the sublimated wish. And so it is a sexual fantasy of rape, but rape is the way that how do I put this? Ill-thinking men who are really messed up in the head believe that the best way to control a woman is to rape her, and you sort of force her to comply to your will, and that asserts your masculinity and compels her to be passive and feminine. So here's Van Helsing's advice. A moment's courage and it is done. This stake must be driven through her. It will be a fearful ordeal, do not be deceived in that, but in only a short time you will rejoice in that your pain was great. Here is the $10,000 phrase. You must not falter when once you have begun. You can't do this halfway. You have to commit to completing this forcible penetration of Lucy's body. Tell me what I am to do. Van Helsing, take this stake in your left hand, place the point over her heart, and the hammer in your right. Then when we begin our prayer for the dead, I'll read it, I have the book here, everyone's going to pray, and you have to strike in God's name so that all may be well with the dead, and that we love, and that the undead pass away. So I'm calling it a gang rape because even though Arthur is the primary agent, the rest of the men are circled around her coffin praying in unison, almost like a chant. Look at this description of Arthur. Arthur took the stake and the hammer, and when once his mind was set on actions, his hands never trembled or even quivered. That's what it means to be a man. So Arthur's masculinity has been restored. He is not seduced by her voluptuousness. He's not going to give way to it. It's a James Bond notion of masculinity, you know, that when seductive women try to ply their trade on you, you are resistant to their charms. So Van Helsing opened his missal and began to read. Quincy and I followed as well as we could. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as I looked, I could see the dint in the white flesh. This is an echo back to Harker with the 3 vampiresses, and I want you to remember that scene that I talked about in lecture last week. They are about the leading dominant female vampire is about to penetrate his neck, and he says that he could feel the dents in the skin on his neck right before penetration, and he struck with all his might. Here is the orgasmic climax of that rape. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the open red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp teeth chomped together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. So there's all this suggestion of saliva and lubrication and blood and penetration and screaming. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving, and look at this, deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, obviously a metaphor for the penis, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled up and spurted around it. His face was set, and his duty seemed to shine through it. That's the superego. The sight of it gave us all courage. Then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, the teeth seemed to champ, and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. The terrible task was over. So she is made inert, restored to her Victorian ideal of the feminine, not expressing any sexuality, being completely passive. He is left gasping for breath, post-orgasmic. It had been an awful strain on him to do this. there in the coffin lay no longer the foul thing that we had so dreaded. What is restored, of course, is the original Lucy. And now, Van Helsing says, now that she is dead, now you can kiss her lips because she can't hurt you. And she's no longer a foul thing. She is God's true dead, and she's gone to heaven. And so Arthur gets to kiss her only after she is worthy of being kissed. That is to say, until she has been restored to her feminine, her purely feminine self. And so all is sweetness and light, and that's how Lucy is restored and restabilized. Her gender queerness or destabilization is restabilized. Let's turn now to chapter 21, and Lucy or Mina with Dracula. So let me find chapter 21 here. 25, sorry. And I'll get you the passage. So this is a scene in Mina's bedroom where Dracula comes in through the window. And what we're looking for all right, here we are. So this is going to be sorry. So the men are locked outside the bedroom, and Mina is inside. And the door is locked, and they are trying to get in. And so they burst in, and it's a coitus interruptus scene, actually, is what it is. They interrupt a rape scene between Dracula and Mina. And Dracula is trying to do to Mina what the four men actually did to Lucy. So Harker says, you know, what I saw appalled me. I felt the hair rise like bristles on the back of my neck, and my heart seemed to stand still. So here's the scene. The moonlight, and again, hearkening, if you forgive the pun, back to Jonathan Harker's experience with the three vampiresses. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind, the room was light enough to see. On the bed, beside the window, lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavy as though he's in a stupor. So Harker now has been reduced to an inert feminine as well. His journey from feminization to the complete feminine is complete here. He is basically forced into a completely passive and inert presence as he has to watch or be witness to Dracula assaulting his wife. Kneeling near the edge of the bed was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw him, we all recognized the Count in every way, even to the scar on his forehead. And here's the scene. With his left hand, he held both Mrs. Parker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. So it is a kind of rape scene. It's, I suppose, a sublimated expression of forcing her face into his crotch, except now he's facing it into his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was torn, which was shown by his torn open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. As we burst into the room, the Count turned his face, and the hellish look that I had heard described to leap into it. His eyes flamed red with a devilish passion. His great nostrils, his aquiline nose flared up, the white sharp teeth behind the lips full of blood, the chomping together just like Lucy. With a wrench, he threw his victim back upon the bed as though hurled from a height. He turned and sprang at us, but by the time the professor had gained his feet and was holding towards him the envelope which contained the sacred wafer, which is the host, the Count suddenly stopped, just as poor Lucy had done outside the tomb, and cowered back. And so this connection to Lucy makes even more explicit the connection that I'm trying to make between the two scenes. And so he retreats. Quincy has a gas light. They sort of get him into a corner. And while they do that, Van Helsing, Art, and I move to Mrs. Harker, who by this time had drawn her breath, and with it had given a scream so wild, so ear-piercing, so despairing, that it seems to me now that it will ring in my ears to my dying day. For a few seconds, she lay in her helpless attitude and disarray. And again, this is the restoration of Mina's queerness back into the feminine. Except the problem this time is that it's Dracula who's done it, and it's an illegitimate way to restore her to the feminine. She's bleeding. Her eyes were mad with terror. Then she put before her face her poor crushed hands, which bore on their whiteness the red marks of the Count's terrible grip. And from behind then came the low desolate wail, which made the terrible scream seem only the quick expression of endless grief. Van Helsing notices that Harker is in a stupor. We can do nothing until Mina awakens. And so they're waiting for Mina to come to. And Harker comes to first. In God's name, what does this mean? So he's finally come back to it. And his wife, through her terror and horror and distress, saw some sure danger to him. Instantly forgetting her own grief, she seized hold of him and cried out, "No, no, Jonathan, you must not leave me. I have suffered enough tonight, God knows, without the dread of this, his harming you. You must stay with me." And Mina begins to blame herself for this assault, calling herself unclean, and falling into to despair. I'll find that for you right now. It's just a couple of paragraphs down. So here's Mina dropping to her knees. She wailed out, "Unclean, out clean, even the Almighty shuns my polluted flesh." So this is the rape victim blaming herself for the assault. "I must bear this mark of shame on my forehead until the judgment day." And so she's now got a mark on her forehead from the Count, just as he had a mark on his forehead from Jonathan Harker's shovel. And it is kind of like the Scarlet Letter in that sense that they are marked for life. So you get this sense that Mina now has been, because of this rape, has been sort of semi-restored to the feminine. However, that journey is not complete until the very prologue of the story. Let me go there very quickly. There it is. So this is a postscript at the end. And it says here, 7 years ago, we all went through the flames. And the happiness of some of us since then is, we think, well worth the pain we endured. It is an added joy to me that our boy's birthday is the same day on which Quincy Morris died. So we know now that Mina has become a mother, that pregnancy and motherhood are the ultimate expression of femininity. And so she, for all of her man brain and all of the masculine work that she has done, she becomes valued basically not because of her brain at the end of it, but because of her uterus and because she's a mother. The idea that Quincy's masculinity would come out of her in the form of a child not only suggests a reincarnation, but by giving birth to Quincy reincarnated into her new son, that Mina has kind of purged from her body the masculine traits that had her in the realm of genderqueer. And so the final interesting thing about all of this is when they find the materials that they had generated. I took the papers from the safe where they had been ever since our return long ago. We were struck with the fact that in all that massive material which the record is composed, there was hardly one authentic document. Nothing but a mass of typewriting, just data and stuff, except for the later notebooks of Mina and Seward and myself and Van Helsing's memorandum. We could hardly ask anyone, even if we did wish it, to accept these as proofs. And so it comes down to this. We want no proofs. We ask none to believe us. We know what we know. And the idea is, I come back to Van Helsing saying, to the men in the story, I want you to believe. Believe in what? To believe in things that you cannot believe in. And so this restoration of the nightmare of destabilizing gender is restored to a kind of normality. There is no proof that it even happened. This is the superego comfortably asserting itself that don't worry, the nightmare has gone away. All your men are going to be masculine, all your females are going to be feminine, and that gender normality has been comfortably restored to everybody.